Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
On June 3rd, we were interviewed on the Australian podcast Watercooler, hosted by Nick Cater.
From the Menzies Research Centre.
Good back and forth. It's an Australian show, so we were up very early, but it was a really exciting time, so it was better than any coffee. We talked about Hong Kong and the situation moving forward. Check it out. I think you'll enjoy the information.
You're watching Watercooler live from the Menzies Research Centre. Please stay with us. We're on until 8:30 Sydney time, 8:05. No, we've got another 25 minutes. We've got Tim Blair, I think one of the funniest men in print, will be joining me just to wrap up proceedings at the end. But first of all, we're going to a subject that's dear to my heart, Hong Kong. I was a correspondent there in the early 90s, and I was there for the handover of Hong Kong, working alongside my then colleague at News Limited, Andrew Bolt. So I was there on the night of the handover, and it was a very moving moment, as you can imagine. But the principle that was at stake was one country, two systems. China agreed to keep to that for 50 years, to 2047. So how are they doing? Well, to help me answer that question and tell us a little bit more about China more generally, let's cross to New York to the co-presenters of a very popular YouTube channel, China Uncensored. Chris Chappell and Shelley John, thank you for joining us, guys. It's pretty early there, right?
It's so exciting to be here, it doesn't even matter.
That's right. I like to think that too. Did you have to break the curfew? Because you've got a curfew there, haven't you, at the moment?
Yeah, there is the curfew. We managed to sneak it in, though. It ended at 5, so we're good.
Just before we go to Chinese matters, I should ask you, what's the atmosphere like there in New York? The pictures look horrendous, the television pictures.
There's been a bit of tension in the air this entire year. Yeah, people have been locked in their homes for quite a while, and now there's a combination of peaceful protesting and then looting, so people are tense.
Well, stay safe. So your channel is enormously successful. I see you have 1.3 million followers, and we've noticed that too. Whenever we've talked about China, there's a tremendous interest from the Chinese diaspora and others who just don't get enough information about it. What drove you to set up China Uncensored?
Yeah, we began the show in 2012, and that was before a lot of people were really openly talking about China. But we kind of saw the huge role China was playing in countries around the world, as well as the atrocities the Communist Party commits on the Chinese people, and it just needed to be brought to light. So we created a show that uses a little bit of satire and humor to try and make it a little more palatable. It's been incredibly successful. I'm really grateful to all the fans of the show.
Shelley, you're the head of humor, I gather, on the show. Is that right?
My title is Humor Ninja. It's a little joke.
Well, I think it's very important, a weapon we have sometimes in making difficult points. But look, the reason I brought you on really was to talk about Hong Kong. I wrote about this in The Australian on Tuesday. I'm desperately concerned about Hong Kong. I know you guys have been there. What's your assessment of where we're at? Is China using this crisis as a way of tightening its grip?
I definitely think the Communist Party was hoping that the world would be too distracted with the coronavirus to really pay attention to what's happening in Hong Kong. I think we've seen over the past couple of months an increasing crackdown in Hong Kong. The protest movement obviously was kind of put on hold because of the coronavirus in Hong Kong as well. And you see how the Hong Kong government is trying to use this extended lockdown for instance, the lockdown is in effect until after June 4th, the Tiananmen Square
and I think they will
now.
keep it going probably until July because of the, anniversary of the handover on July 1st, as you know. And they've also extended like the ban on foreign arrivals for 3 months now. So that will prevent a lot of like foreign correspondents from being able to travel to Hong Kong like we did last year to cover the protests.
You were there, weren't you, for the protests? They seemed to get pretty willing at times, even though the protesters, by and large, were peaceful.
Woolly? What nice colloquialisms you have.
It's an Australian phrase. Pretty willing. It means it gets a little bit.
Yeah, I think we saw like a real evolution in the protests because we were there as soon as police fired tear gas on June 12th to disperse protesters. We got on a plane that same day. So we were there for like the 2 million people march, the 1 million person march in June, the July 1st protest where the protesters broke into the Legislative Council. And then we went back in September and October to for the protests that were to commemorate the anniversary of, Chinese Communist Party rule in China. So we definitely saw the protest tactics get more kind of like confrontational with the police. But one thing
also, the focus of the protest changed a lot too, from being just about the extradition bill to increasing to 5 demands to very specifically going after the Chinese Communist Party itself.
Yeah, but I think one thing we noticed about any violence used in the protest was very targeted towards the state. If they were breaking windows, it was always a government building or some kind of company that was perceived to be supporting the Chinese state and how they, oppressed the Hong Kong people. So it was very targeted. Nobody was hurt, or very few people were hurt by the protesters. And you could see that they had like a very specific way that they were trying to use some of these tactics, like setting small fires in the street to help the protesters get away from the police who were chasing them. So it wasn't like massive, indiscriminate rioting, and I don't believe there's been any looting.
The role of the police seems to change, certainly over the last year. It was a police force established clearly by the British. The British while they were there, and it was a police force that was based on the model of policing that emerged in the early 19th century in Britain under Robert Peel. It's the model of policing we've got here. Essentially, the police are citizens in uniform. They're there to keep the peace for all of us. They're not there to enforce the will of the state. Now, that's clearly a contrast with China. Seemed to me that we've moved from one to the other in very short order.
Well, again, we were in Hong Kong for the 2014 umbrella movement, and there was a big change in the police force from then to now. I think what happened was over the years between 2014 and now, I think the Hong Kong police force got a lot harder. I think more moderate people were probably forced out, and it was amazing to see in these protests how aggressive the police were, not just to protesters, but to even bystanders. We were at an event one time there where there weren't protesters. It was just police and bystanders in essentially a Times Square kind of area. And then the police just went nuts and started tear gassing everyone. And I think the real risk now is there was a so-called independent investigation into the police force that was not independent at all, and it cleared the police of any negligence, any form of police brutality. So I think the police have been essentially told they have carte blanche to do whatever they want.
And yeah, we've seen in recent protests that they just started tear gassing right away when the protests started. Protests have been peaceful. They'll get tear gassed anyway. They're just trying to prevent people from being able to gather at all.
They're really becoming an extension of the arm of Beijing, particularly if this national security law goes through, and then you actually will see Chinese police operating in Hong Kong.
And let's talk about the protests or the people that are protesting. It's amazing. You see people out there that probably very little memory, if any memory, of British rule, and yet they just sense that something about the country is changing, and they don't want it.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of the younger protests, people in their teens and 20s, they grew up under communist rule in Hong Kong and have slowly seen how the Chinese Communist Party has tried to undermine their freedoms and their way of life from the time that they were kids, if they were, middle school maybe or high school during the umbrella movement, seeing the people that they vote into office getting disqualified, kicked out of the legislature, seeing all these little ways that the Chinese Communist Party is not keeping their promise to let Hong Kong be Hong Kong until 2047. So that's really, over time, hardened people's, attitude towards the Chinese government and towards the Hong Kong government, which they see as basically having no power because the Chinese state is the one that has the real power.
What makes the contrast for me is I remember the Tiananmen Square incident and what happened afterwards. That many Chinese students fled the country, fled China, and a lot of them did so by fast boat from the Pearl Delta across to Hong Kong, and they were trying desperately to do it at night so that the Hong Kong police didn't stop them and send them back. Now, the irony now is that people are fleeing Hong Kong in fast boats, heading for Taiwan, and they're still dodging the police, but this time because the police would try and keep them there. This is the turning point, isn't it? I mean, is there a way back now towards freedom for Hong Kong at this point?
That's definitely the big question. As long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power, Hong Kong will never be free.
I think that's definitely true, and the Hong Kong protesters are willing to. They understand this. They say things like, if we burn, you burn with us. They're willing to, essentially almost sacrifice Hong Kong if they feel that they're able to deal a death blow to the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a lot of, the more extreme the crackdown gets, the more that Hong Kong people, the protesters, they say they're willing to go down fighting for their home.
So do you think they will continue to take to the streets and make their voices known despite the crackdown?
One thing I've noticed about the protesters is how inventive and creative they are. They've found ways to change their tactics and keep adapting to police actions. This movement was definitely kind of under the surface during the coronavirus lockdown. But, I think you will see, we can't even predict how they're going to adapt to the current situation. They're not going anywhere.
I agree. And I think that the people of Hong Kong, even the ones who aren't out on the streets protesting, the majority of them support the protests.
That's true.
And the more that the crackdown continues, the more people kind of come out and, you have to kind of pick a side now. Are you with the Chinese government or are you with the protesters? And more people have shown that they are in fact supporting the protesters, and it's something that's changing Hong Kong society.
Which was one of the lies the Communist Party and the Hong Kong government was trying to push, that the protesters are just a loud minority. The silent majority really loves the Communist Party. But in local elections last year, we saw that was not the case. People voted essentially pro-democracy. Also, the fact that 2 million people in a city of 7 million people came out to march on a single day, that kind of shows where popular sentiment lies.
Now, your president, Donald Trump, I gather he's got his critics in America. Not everybody is a fan of Donald Trump, but from our perspective here, in this zone of influence, we're really encouraged at the stand that Trump has taken on China. He's prepared to he recognises what's going on, and he's prepared to take them on. Is that a widespread feeling in the United States, or is it just his side of politics?
Well, saying Trump is a controversial figure is certainly an understatement. But you've seen the Trump administration take a really solid stance against the Chinese Communist Party, particularly in relation to Hong Kong. And you've seen widespread bipartisan support for this, particularly for Hong Kong. So this is really not a left-right, Republican-Democrat issue anymore. I think people have seen what the Hong Kong protesters are fighting for, and it's something that Americans really understand and appreciate. They're fighting for their freedom. They're fighting for the right to live how they want. So,
yeah, I would say there's a lot of sympathy here for Hong Kong. And although I think many Americans aren't quite aware yet of exactly what the U.S. government is doing in terms of China, I think that will become more apparent as the months go on. And, generally, the American people's view of China has gotten more negative, of the Chinese government has gotten more negative after the coronavirus, after the Hong Kong protests. So I think we'll be seeing more support for, just a tougher stance on China across the board.
And it's really encouraging to see that tough talk is being backed with tough action.
So look, fine, let's go play the devil's advocate here. What does it matter in the end? I mean, China takes control of Hong Kong, 27 years before it said it would. Is that really a big deal? Does that matter an awful lot to the rest of us?
Well, it would certainly matter to the people of Hong Kong. But the reason this is such a serious issue for countries around the world is like, look, the Chinese Communist Party made an agreement with the UK about Hong Kong, and obviously they lied. So how can any country trust any agreement with the Chinese Communist Party? Particularly, this even extends to Chinese businesses, because the Communist Party has tremendous control over every major business and industry in China. They're controlled for political purposes. There is no one can reasonably say we can deal with the Chinese Communist Party as a good faith partner. That's an illusion that is over.
And I think the people of Hong Kong want to make this their warning to the world as well. There's been lots of slogans in the protests in English saying things like, Hong Kong is first, you are next, the world is next, be aware of, don't trust the Chinese Communist Party, these kinds of things, because the Hong Kong people see it and they want the rest of the world to know.
And a very clear example of this is the amount of control China has in the UN, and in particularly the World Health Organization. You've seen how the Chinese Communist Party has gotten the World Health Organization to basically back them in the cover-up of the coronavirus. The World Health Organization has been praising China's transparent response to the coronavirus, when in fact it's very clear that the reason the entire world was put into this crisis was because of a cover-up.
Chris, Shelley, thank you very much for joining us at a very early hour in New York. I wish you all the best, and I will just point people once again to your YouTube channel, China Uncensored. You've got some great episodes on there already, and we'll look forward to many more to come. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Great being here.